Welcome to PR on the Record, the podcast that explores the role of PR in shaping success within the global tech ecosystem. I'm Shahni Ben Haim.
I'm Ariel Shahni. Today we're excited to welcome Sarah Bard to the podcast. Sarah is a former White House appointed senior leader at the US Small Business Administration, where she oversaw public affairs for the cabinet agency that managed a $1 trillion small business financing portfolio. She has served as an advisor on 5 US presidential campaigns and was named one of Jerusalem Post's 50 most influential Jews. Sarah has led communications for TriVentures VC and fintech Melio and worked with leading companies and CEOs in Israel and in the US. Today, she is a senior advisor at Berlin Rosen and also advises companies on go-to-market strategies and business development. Sarah is also an advisor at CET Sandbox, is an adjunct professor at Tel Aviv University, was recently appointed to the executive board of the Nevo Network, which works to promote Olim in tech.
Today, Sarah's going to be cluing us in on what ROI and PR really means and how to gauge the KPIs tech companies should be looking at when it comes to PR efforts. We hope you enjoy our conversation with Sarah.
Welcome, Sarah.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Great to have you with us. We're really excited about this conversation. I'm just going to dive in because you've got such an amazing background and such great experience. We mentioned in the intro that you worked in politics, you transitioned to tech after that. So I was just wondering, how have you managed to successfully move from presidential campaigns to tech? Are they like two very different areas?
They're the exact same thing, but I think tech has better pizza. If you look at the state of a US presidential campaign, these are actually the fastest growing startups that exist in the world. You raise and spend about $2 billion in usually about less than a year. And the whole goal is that you are able to capture roughly 70 million people to come out and vote for you on one day in November. Compare that budget and that speed to any other startup that exists in the world today. I think US presidential campaigns are still the fastest growing startups in the world.
Wow. So I imagine then it feels almost as if it's even more fast paced than the tech world. So you might feel like a bit more relaxed in what I say is a startup, fast paced environment. Like you said, it's the fastest kind of startup in the world. So imagine now it feels a bit more relaxed, or is that wrong to say?
Luckily, none of the projects that I have worked on since moving into tech have been sleepy or slow. For me, I think it's the same pace, although the horizon might be a little bit different. But I think it's the same thing that draws people to work in tech is very much the same thing that draws a lot of people to work in politics and presidential campaigns. And I think you'll see there's a lot of similarities between founders and candidates and the teams that they build around them, and incredibly mission-driven, goal-oriented, and very disciplined.
Oh, absolutely. And it's actually funny because you're talking about the pace of the presidential campaign and how it's, essentially very short-term and short-sighted. But when, I talk to my clients, I always tell them PR is the long game. We have to obviously have some short-term goals, but ultimately we're looking at the long-term effects. So how would you explain, the value that companies should expect from PR efforts, kind of with that in mind?
So I actually usually like to ask a question before that, which is, what is the business strategy right now? What are the business objectives that the larger company has? What are the Q1? What are the Q2? What are those KPIs as a company? What are the milestones that the larger team has to meet? And then laddering down, how does PR and comms support a strategic business objective? And so it really depends. Look, I think that if your motivation and the reason that you need to do PR and comms is brand building, that's a longer horizon. If it is to help with organic traffic and user acquisition, that can be a shorter horizon. Partnerships, business development, rapidly planting your flag and getting some name recognition in industry. That can be a matter of days or weeks. Talent recruitment, similarly a short timeline. And then on the other side, which sometimes we don't like to talk about, but in handling crisis communication, PR's impact, you can measure that in seconds or minutes, especially for a publicly traded company.
PR creates a lot of outside influences on what's happening inside of the company, is what you're saying.
That too, but I think also, and look, I think I've always been of the belief of outside in, that the message that you're sharing with your team or the message that you're sharing with the public, you have to have, it has to match. The values have to match. And I think that that's incredibly important. And so while I know that most times people think about PR and comms as an external role, and most of the time it is, there's also a really critical part that is helping shape the internal voice of the company, helping take that external message that you might be taking out to customers or to the market or to investors, and also translating that inside your team to keep your team focused, to get them information. It's one of those functions that can sit horizontally across the organization. The challenge, I think, is always limiting where it is and where it's not, because obviously there are, resource constraints.
Yeah, that makes total sense.
Definitely.
And I assume with that, when you're trying to get the message internally, as you just mentioned, you're looking at it from top-down approach. So it should come from, the CEO and then all the way down. We've seen recently, with Tesla, for example, their shares plummeting because something their CEO did. So is that what you mean by that?
I think that that's probably the use case that most people think about, but real excellent teams and teams that I have worked with, these are always teams that are really built from the grassroots level, from the ground up. And I'm proud to say that some of the best ideas and pitches and campaigns that I have managed and run, sometimes that idea came from somebody who this was maybe their first or second job because they saw something different about the company or the customer or our impact and their mission. And so I think, terrific organizations who have terrific internal communications, it's a stream, it's a circle that is always flowing. But certainly, I think most people will probably identify it first as executive communication. But I really think the real value is creating that circular economy of information inside a company.
And that projects to kind of the outside. From what I've seen in companies that have great internal communications, usually from the outside, you can see that.
Yeah, and the converse is true as well. I think companies that have, you can tell sometimes companies that the team is not all on the same page. And that usually, unfortunately, that comes out in negative ways.
So then for those companies, what would you suggest needs to change? Is there a pathway to make that better for them? When there's already issues, how do you build them back up? What's the pathway to rebuilding those communications?
Look, I think for anyone who has led or managed PR or comms in a company, if you're looking at the internal side of the company, your partners are really the people team, the HR teams, management. And I think it's an incredible opportunity to take what we know about communication and messaging and to help work with those other teams to help shape some of the key messaging, some of the cadence, sometimes also helping shape some of the listening abilities as well. And so terrific communication, again, that I have seen that is mirrored inside and outside of the company. Sometimes communication is the actual, okay, we're working with the media, we're working with the message. Other times it's also more of the soft skill.
Speaking of, speaking with the media and versus internal communications, Ariel and I, when we work with tech companies, we reach out to media in order to help arrange conversations for executives at the companies. And in the years that we've been working between us, I've mentioned that we have 2 decades between us of PR experience, and 1/3 of major media organizations have had immense layoffs in the last few years. How has that impacted how hard it is to get picked up in the news, or with the companies that you work? How competitive is it? What's the answer to that of how you're getting traction, essentially?
So I think it has absolutely made it a lot harder to get attention. Um, Not only do you have perhaps less specialists sometimes in some of these newsrooms, and if you're a tech company, there's very few tech companies that are really like generalist tech stories. So you have fewer specialists. They are getting absolutely inundated with pitches. I think I saw something that showed, in 1 week, TechCrunch had run 9 stories about funding rounds, but there had really been something like 75 funding rounds that week. They're completely inundated. I will also say, I think a lot of the pitches that they're getting and that sometimes we hear, they can tell that these are pitches generated in ChatGPT, so they're not very good pitches necessarily. Um, so it's absolutely more difficult to get notice and to get attention. I think that, sometimes maybe you think, okay, it's just about wording the pitch perfectly, and it's like shooting an arrow and you hit the target. It is that. You have to develop an excellent pitch, but you also have to do some of the groundwork in the market first, starting with some of those niche, more perhaps trade industry specific outlets, doing podcasts, doing a feature or interview with a popular industry blogger. Those are some really good ways to build up some traction and also to kind of help, the journalist who now is covering 13 different different sectors or areas, give them something a little bit to work with. You're not invisible out there. So I think that building up to that moment of when it is that you're trying to pitch Wired or TechCrunch is incredibly important.
I can agree, more with what you just said. It's for me, it's always about momentum over moments, essentially, which is why I like to work with companies on a more long-term basis than for one-off campaigns. But I just wanted to pick up on something you were saying, about ChatGPT, because that's obviously a hot topic right now. But I feel like AI it's here to stay. It's only going to get better. It's only going to get more insightful and hopefully better at what it does. So, where do you see the role of AI expanding and being helpful in PR?
It's a terrific question. Let me start off by saying where I think it is not helpful, which is in a lot of the press releases or announcement that I see some companies put out who are not working with a PR professional. And I think again, it is creating a lot more clutter and maybe a little bit more, I would almost say, garbage in certain inboxes, because a lot of times this is generic sounding. And keep in mind, AI, even the best AI that I've seen at this point, you're still going to sound like 95% of everyone else that is out there. And the whole point of PR, it's earned media. You earn the right to be that 5% that's interesting. And so, this happens quite often. I see a company who has some important news that I think is usually very market worthy. They crunch some marketing language through ChatGPT. They come up with a very generic sounding press release that sounds like a lot of marketing language. And they shoot this off to journalists, in a blast all at one time. They might email 50 journalists with the same exact press release. And so why doesn't this work? Number one, I think a lot of journalists that I've worked with will tell you they're very allergic to marketing language. These are people who have dedicated their lives and careers towards analyzing language. They can usually tell instantly that it's a ChatGPT. So why should they take the time to cover your story if you're not even going to take the time to pitch it authentically to them? And then I think also a lot of people don't take the time to actually really think and understand, let's say, I'm pitching Wired or TechCrunch. Who are their readers? What does the specific journalist cover? What has she or he covered before? It's incredibly important when you're pitching that you fit into the profile of the story, but it's never going to be all about you. I think that that's really important to say. So where do I see AI helping a lot? Um, I can say personally, it helps me scan and digest large amounts of information quickly so that I can continue and do the traditional research methods that I used to do. And for that, I use Perplexity, which interestingly enough, I heard in an interview recently that they do not pay for marketing, that their growth strategy has very much been supported by doing PR only. So interesting to know.
That's great to hear. It means that what we do is still valuable to companies that choose to go that route and choose to focus on their communications outward instead of, the marketing, the performance marketing, ad placements, and stuff like that, which is great to hear because I think that, I'm shifting kind of the topic over, but we recently spoke about how to define KPIs and ROI, and we'd love to hear your insights on a bit about how you, I guess, define ROI and PR, especially for tech companies. Like, how do you guide tech companies in setting realistic KPIs for PR?
That's a terrific question. So I think first, again, we really just have to start with what is the goal of PR? Is it investor relations or fundraising? Is it talent acquisition, business development, organic traffic, brand, or all of the above? And then I think secondly, it's understanding who exactly is the audience. The strategies for PR that a B2C tech company needs to do are very different than what a B2G or maybe even B2B. And you really have to know who are they, where are they, what media do they consume. So, for example, for a B2C company that is trying to sell a product mass market, I think there's a few different ways that I could look at what makes an impact. There's a measure called share of voice, which measures how often the company is included and noted in the media. But it backs out, it minuses things, your own press releases. I think that's a good external measure. Average yearly syndication, how many times stories that are written about you in primary sources get picked up by other sources. Increase in media mentions are usually a good one. Sometimes I think it is also interesting to look at the aggregate reach of the covered outlets. Although in the age where people are consuming their media more through links on social media, it's a little bit harder I think that's a harder KPI to track and to goal for, because it's not that people are going necessarily the same way they used to, which is like, I'm going to go to the New York Times website and I'm going to read all the stories there. I think some other ways that I think are really interesting for talent recruitment, I think that can actually be pretty immediate and obvious. You can hear and you can see in the volume of resumes that your company might be getting, and you can understand where they're coming from, how they heard about the company, what they learned about the company. And also, if you are focused on, perhaps you have a B2B product, organic industry awards, and these aren't the awards that you pay for. I don't think that those are real awards. Industry awards, recognition, things like that. I think those are tremendously important. But it has to start from a place of what is our business goal, who is our audience, and then what is the impact that drives and helps a specific business objective. You hear this joke amongst PR comms people that we grumble that everyone just thinks that they'll be on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. And we're always telling them, well, the quickest way to do that is to get in really big trouble or to do a mass layoff or fire CEO. So my point there is that, each company is going to potentially have a different business objective, and having PR and comms that is valuable towards that business objective, that might look a little different for each company.
That's a really smart and really thoughtful answer. As you say, everyone will usually come to us and say, yeah, front page of New York Times or whatever. And you've given a few examples of success, but for you, is there anything better really still the media coverage, or as you say, it's kind of a combination of factors?
Look, I think the way that people are consuming information, and I think the channels that they trust are constantly changing. I think people again, especially in the age of AI, the way that they even find different SaaS solutions is changing. You can go to ChatGPT and say, hey, I'm looking for just like an excellent uh, product, to help automate compliance at my company, something like that. Um, I think it's changing all the time. I think that media will continue and will always play, for the foreseeable future, an incredible role as a source of validation, as a source of trust, as a source of authority. I don't see that changing anytime soon, although again, the composition of the media, the platforms that it's on, that will change.
Definitely. And we've seen that, even now. And I'm not sure if I mentioned this on a previous episode, but I think that when I send out a pitch to journalists and I constantly see them coming back with, this is a really great topic of conversation, but I have no time for an interview, write a thought leadership piece, right? And I'm coming to clients and I'm saying that this is the nature of what's happening right now. Aside from if it's like a very unique story, they're being more selective, and like you said, there was 9 funding announcements out of the 75 that there were happening that week being published, and that's just the reality that days we live in right now in the media landscape. You also mentioned social media and how that kind of plays into the communications of your company. How do you see, where do you see PR going in the future, heading more towards these platforms where companies can speak to their own voice, or continuing to pursue these quote unquote traditional, media exposure? You mentioned third-party validation from those media outlets, but what else do those things bring to companies? Is there anything else?
That's a great question. I hope I can follow the thread. I actually just spoke about this yesterday. I'm an adjunct professor at the university, and I teach a graduate course on communications. And I was explaining how back in my day, and I'm going to date myself, but 20 years ago, if you had some big news that you wanted to get out, you wrote a press release. There was a certain font, there was a certain size, style. You called a press conference and you distributed that, and then you followed up with some of the reporters. And so at that, back in those days, you still had a tremendous amount of control over your message. And to some extent, how well your message got carried through in the press was largely dependent on maybe your relationship, your past with the media outlets. Today, it's significantly more fragmented. There's more niche media, and everyone in this ecosystem has a lot more power, individual power. And so companies, I think, need to get even smarter and sharper on the branding side and the story side of what they do, because they have, in some ways, you have to give up a lot more control, or you have to assume that you're going to lose a lot more of control of that message as it bounces around between, social media amplifiers, traditional media, new media, etc. And I think the moment of transformation is really, it's less control once it leaves your hands, but you have to do a better job of establishing what that core message is earlier.
Thank you so much. Knowing that we have all these new mediums in play in terms of media, why should companies still pursue traditional media even though they have that less control, when those other mediums give them more control because it's their own voice? And like the constant question that I get back is like the ROI, the dollar for dollar. Like, we can't measure it here, and of course there's other values, but they're very stringent in that they want to know the money that is coming back in from these efforts. And sometimes we just say it's not about the dollar for dollar, it's about the voice, it's about becoming, a unique industry voice and leading the conversation and being a part of the conversation rather than standing on the sidelines. Maybe you have another take, or you're in agreement. I'd love to hear.
Sure. So I think maybe I'll share this a little bit from maybe the company's side, maybe the company's perspective a little bit more. And I should say there's a huge difference between what a company is trying to do if they're an early stage company versus what they're trying to do if they're a later stage company. There's a huge difference between a company that is in the market and competing with other companies versus other companies who are maybe breaking a new technology and they have to educate the market. There's a difference between companies that are in highly regulated spaces, such as healthcare, for example, versus companies that are in not so regulated spaces. I think one of the first things that we all, as PR and comms professionals, need to adapt to, and maybe this is an internal branding exercise we have to take upon ourselves, is we can no longer go to a CEO or pitch a company on quote unquote traditional media. Podcasts play an incredibly important role. This podcast, I kind of hate the word influencer, but maybe influencer, industry experts, platforms, but traditional media has to be part of a larger, more comprehensive strategy. So how do you pitch the ROI? I find that, I think half of the time this is about really listening to what the company needs, really listening to what their business objectives are. And then the other part is really teaching and showing where the value is. I believe very strongly in dashboards and KPIs and metrics. And maybe this is something from the campaign world, which is that, you measure everything, you tweak everything, and if it's not working, you shift strategy very quickly. But I always suggest for PR and comms professionals, you should be keeping a monthly dashboard. What KPIs you measure might change over time. You might have a hypothesis, but what happens is that sometimes there can be these long lulls of work between times that stories get picked up. But you need to always be pitching. You need to always be hustling. You need to always be trying. We're always going to have to play a role educating. And it's also our job to stay on top of, how is that ball that's bouncing between influencers, traditional media, new media, where's that ball? And we have to always try to be on top of that ball and figure out where it's going. Another side, which again, we don't always like to talk about this, is that sometimes you measure the ROI on what doesn't get published. It is increasingly hard, I think, for companies in this age when there is so much that is going on, and making sure that you have the right message, making sure that, for example, if you're the target of a lawsuit, how are you controlling that message? And so people don't always think about the crisis comms scenarios, but I think those are incredibly important. I think also probably only someone from presidential campaigns maybe leads with crisis comms when they pitch, but but that's something I have to work on.
No, I hear that. I think generally when people who don't know much about PR think about PR, they probably think about crisis comms as well. They've probably seen West Wing or those kind of programs, and so I think it's just kind of where the mind goes when you think about PR, just naturally, unless you work in the industry. And with all those kind of the new media, the podcasts, all of those, the I suppose tactics, if you want to call them that didn't exist 5-10 years ago. And we talked about just ROI just before. Do you have a way of prioritizing which podcasts or which opportunities someone should explore?
That's absolutely a terrific question. Again, there's a lot that really depends on lining up your business objective and really understanding your customer. So, for example, early stage companies invest a tremendous amount of time and research mapping details of the user journey when they're in the early stages of building a product. They need to have the same understanding about what their customers, what the market, what other stakeholders, what is the media diet that they are consuming. I can tell you as a busy mom, I default to podcasts because that way I can, do two things at one time. It's harder for me to sit down and actually read a newspaper the way that I used to. We don't even get a newspaper subscription anymore. I read it online. So it's really understanding where you can tell the best story. And I think there is going to be those times that you are trying to maximize for broad reach. There's other times you're trying to maximize for niche. I think that I think a lot of companies maybe skip over or try to skip over doing some of that more niche industry targeted outreach and media. And by the way, that is where you are talking to the most passionate types of people in your industry. It's an incredible source of validation. But I feel like that sometimes people try to skip over that step. And I think that that's a mistake.
Certainly, I've had that experience where, I'm supporting an executive in an interview, and the reporter and the executive are talking about something so specific and niche to the industry, and they're just enjoying the conversation more so. I think they forget sometimes that they're in an interview, not in a bad way in terms of that it can go to different places, but in the way that they're just geeking out on the topic.
Yeah.
So it's lovely when that happens with those niche industry verticals. And it's also, if it's such a specific topic, like you said, that's kind of where, depending on what their goal is with PR, who their audience is where there's impact in the end.
Yeah, I also, to pull something out of politics is that, in politics and presidential campaigns, you always talk about you have your base, right? And then you have all of the voters that you need to persuade. And sequentially, you really need to get your base excited and mobilized and in it first as you go out to persuade. And so, those larger horizons of, maybe that TechCrunch article or, that HBR idea podcast, that is also built on a foundation, I think, of having a lot of excitement and momentum in the specific sector that you're in.
Yes, I love this. Sorry, this is what I tell my clients. So it's really good for me to have my validation of, you need to build the foundations of the trades and then potentially look further afield. So I'm really excited. And Shahni just mentioned geeking out. I feel like that's what I'm doing right now, because this is like such an interesting conversation, and to be speaking with you who got such a broad experience and probably one of the best certainly in Israel. So that's really cool. No, I was going to come back to what we were talking about educating. I think that's a really important role in PR, and I find it's one of the hardest, parts to do, especially if you're trying to talk about something that's not being spoken about generally, even in trade media. Do you have any thoughts on the best way to approach those scenarios?
So this is on the educating, the companies and tech leaders on media. Look, I think one of the first and most important steps for anyone in PR and comms to do is put yourself in a position of, put yourself in the shoes, put yourself in the position of somebody who is perhaps a performance marketing person, put yourself in the position of a product person. Really understand how the different levers of the company are working and how they're working together. Understand what are those main kind of KPI dashboard items that the CEO is presenting to investors every month or every quarter. And, really be smart about how you show up in that bigger picture, right? And, sometimes that means it's a very close alignment with performance marketing because you want to help track organic traffic. Sometimes that's a very close alignment with like maybe the business development team because you want to have a better understanding of, how are those outbound cold calls going, when we have had press coverage versus when we haven't. So I think it really first starts with understanding what's going on in other parts of the company and understanding, of course, where's the management team, like where's their eye in the ball. Again, in cases of crisis management, that takes over everybody and everything. But hopefully most companies avoid that. But I think that we have to do a better job of being able to track and measure our work in terms and ways that make sense to the teams that we are working with. And I think a lot of times where sometimes we hit this point is, I can say, like, I'm a very right-brained person, big stories, emotions, values, colors, hand gestures. A lot of tech founders are left-brained. These are technical co-founders, and they do tremendously well when they understand a linear relationship and they see data. And so if that is who your client is, that is who your boss is, you need to find a way to show that in your work.
100%. Thank you, Sarah, so much for your time. You gave a lot of information and a lot of pieces of advice, both to myself and Ariel, if I could speak for Ariel, and say, beyond that, if you could package all of that into one kind of distinct sentence, what is one piece of advice that you would give tech companies on maximizing the impact and value of their PR opportunities?
You are not the main story. You might not be the main character. You might not be the hero. Really, I think terrific PR and media coverage is always about a larger story. How is a new technology transforming something? How is there a certain group of customers or people that are being helped, that are being changed because of it? How does maybe the founders, a unique founder story, how does this story, what's the larger picture? So it's never about you, it's a larger picture.
Thank you so much for sharing from your experience. I feel that the PR profession, in time, with more experience, we just get better and better. And hearing from what you've done and hearing from other people in the field really makes me feel like I'm sharper with the things that I do. So truly, truly, thank you. Ariel, anything?
Thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it. It's been a great conversation.
Wonderful.
Great.
This was fun. Thank you.
That was our conversation with the amazing Sarah Bard. We hope you enjoyed it.
And if you're a founder trying to get your startup noticed, a marketer looking to up your PR game, or just curious about the stories behind the headlines, we hope this conversation gave you more of an inside look.
Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And if you have any questions or suggestions on topics we should talk about, send us your thoughts at prontheRec@gmail.com. That's prontheRec@gmail.com. Thank you all for listening. And again, I'm Ariel.
And I'm Shahni. And this was PR on the record, going off the record. See you next time.